Whirly bird, whirly bird, whirly bird, whirly bird. Santa's coming in a whirly bird. The news is out and I've been told it came by wire from the great North Pole. I'm sure each boy and girlie heard Santa Claus has got a new whirly bird. Santa's coming in a whirly bird. Christmas night in a whirly bird. So if you're good and you don't goof, the whirly bird's gonna land on your roof. Whirly bird, whirly bird, whirly bird, whirly bird. Santa's coming in a whirly bird. Cheers. God damn. I know you guys aren't used to seeing me in a sweater, and you might start seeing me to sweat during the episode, but I got my COVID booster yesterday, my belated COVID booster. I should have gotten it a while ago. It was kicking my ass all last night, and I've still got a little of the chills, so yeah, it's time for cozy Ian mode on this day's episode. And in case you're wondering, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and this is the new movie diary in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. Well, the Christmas decorations aren't coming out of my bins in the near future, but everywhere I look, I'm already starting to see the bobs and ornaments creeping over every storefront and office, like the green moss that took poor Geordie Verrill. Therefore, in the spirit of the impending holiday, I'm coming through with a Too Soon for Christmas double feature, and while I would have preferred to catch Alexander Payne's latest for the occasion, I figured I would be better off by pairing up the two more obscure holiday-themed fare that premiered at our multiplexes last Thursday. On the one hand, a faith-based musical dramatizing the story of the Christian Nativity, and on the other, a Christmas-themed slasher. Seems like an excellent pairing, right? More regular viewers should already be well acquainted by my fascination with faith-based media, but on the other hand, I'm no snob when it comes to a good splatter flick, so while I could have traded out one of these selections for The Holdovers, it just didn't feel right. It just seemed like this wasn't just a gold standard double feature because of its holiday theming, but also because of how both of these films were fairly low budget and narrowly targeted to fairly divergent audience demographics, how both of them basically have no prestige or word of mouth accompanying them. Look, at the very least, I was just looking forward to a not exceptionally weighty time at the movies after a couple of weeks of seeing some pretty weighty films, just good old-fashioned light entertainment with some variety mixed in, and yeah, I should have seen The Holdovers, because both of these movies were garbage. Starting things off, we've got Journey to Bethlehem. This is the latest release by Affirm Films, a Sony Pictures subsidiary that has really come into its own as a major player in the mainstreaming of faith-based and Christian films. And with Journey to Bethlehem, and with the not quite so successful Big George Foreman biopic that they helped co-produce this year as well, also seems to be joining the general trend of Christian films becoming far less insular as a commercial niche. Which is to say that in relative terms, and I went into this a little bit on my September 18th episode when I reviewed the stealth Christian family comedy Camp Hideout, faith-based media is kind of ascendant right now, not the least because of general cultural trends in which we're seeing a more concerted minority Christian conservative movement to push into popular culture in order to directly compete with, rather than simply offering an alternative to secular media. But also because whether you're talking about independent Christian media companies or secular media conglomerates like Sony that have faith-based subsidiaries, there seems to be more conscientiousness about the fact that there are more openings in the consumer market, including theatrical exhibition, to say nothing of streaming and video on demand, that are really incentivizing producers of Christian media to try to raise their game somewhat in terms of not only providing a diversity of film in genres like original traditional live-action musicals that major secular studios don't really touch very much anymore, but also in improving production value, of not relying on the traditional charismatic focus of faith-based media, but really trying to create low to mid-budget films that have a certain professional look that makes you feel like you're watching a real movie and not just a Christian movie. As I said, the production of Christian media is growing increasingly less insular. It's being done with an increasing mindset of looking for talent outside of the traditional channels of individuals vetted within the Christian media ecosystem, which brings us to Journey to Bethlehem, which, despite being perhaps one of the most traditional of subjects for a Christian movie, a story from the New Testament about the Immaculate Conception and the birth of Jesus Christ, you're bringing in the prestige of director Adam Anders, who, while he's no stranger to faith-based media, having served as an executive producer on The Passion, not The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, but The Passion, a live broadcast jukebox musical from 2016 that attempts to tell the story of Jesus' death and resurrection in a modern setting using contemporary hit pop songs. Adam Anders is much better known primarily as a songwriter and music producer, especially for the TV series Glee. So, not necessarily the sort of guy who in a previous generation of Christian media would be seen as the sort of person you even let get within 3 feet of a movie about the Nativity, in terms of his work being synonymous with not just secular programming, but really also programming that promotes exactly the sorts of woke, multicultural, liberal values that is energizing the conservative base of Christian consumers right now. I'd also like to highlight that before this, in 2020, Anders also served as a music producer on the Netflix original The Prom, which is a musical comedy literally about a high school prom being canceled by a conservative Christian PTA crank because a lesbian student was planning on going with her girlfriend. So, really a guy who plays two sides of the field on this. This is a faith-based movie from a major faith-based media subsidiary, at least, where the primary creative voices behind it are individuals who have kind of straddled professional circles between secular and faith-based media. It's also co-written by Anders and Peter Barsaccini, who's previously served as a writer on the very successful High School Musical franchise, so you get a sense from these behind-the-scenes tidbits of Journey to Bethlehem kind of being born of a really new moment in ascendant Christian media, where there's more of an emphasis on technical pedigree, and for that I do have to say that while Journey to Bethlehem is obviously squeezing $6 million in budget for all of its worth, it continues a trend of fairly impressive Christian productions. It never really achieves escape velocity in terms of convincing you that, say, when you're in the village of Nazareth, that you're really losing yourself in the setting. But then again, it seems rather clear that a movie like Journey to Bethlehem isn't necessarily trying to be terribly convincing. There's an extent to which I think it's fair to say that Anders is actually aiming for a kind of cozy feeling of artificiality. Like, we're not seeing a big, extravagant Hollywood musical, but more something like we're appreciating the production for what, for lack of a better way of putting it, I guess you could call a local theater or an off-Broadway vibe. This vibe of the production itself feeling like its ambitions don't go very far beyond just trying to entertain us with a cute story and some nice show tunes, with a lot of performers and technical people who are giving it their all in spite of the limitations, and you kind of identify with the film on that level. Which is not to say that I don't think there are impressive aspects about this musical production that do exceed its limitations, or at least complement them rather well. I think the main thing that it gets right for its low budget, besides its production and costume design, is its choreography. In particular, there's this really interesting musical number called The Ultimate Deception, which sees actor Milo Manheim as Joseph reckoning with his internal conflict over thinking that Mary, now pregnant with the Messiah, Messiah has committed adultery and, in the custom of his time, wishes that she was stoned to death, but is torn between that feeling and his lingering faith that she's telling the truth about her immaculate conception. This is a really interesting number, I should say. I really like how, with some really simple body double work and trick photography, Mannheim is able to portray two sides of Joseph as these two individuals, one clad in red, the other clad in black, dancing and fighting with each other. I also really liked both the choreography and the vocal talent on display in the sequence for In My Blood, which is delivered by the character Antipater, the son of Herod the Great, played by Joel Smallbone, who most secular viewers won't be familiar with, but many diehard Christian pop audiences will recognize as one half of the Australian pop duo For King and Country. He's able to show a very impressive vocal range in this on the deeper side with In My Blood, and then in the higher register with Good to Be King, where he sings backup for none other than Antonio Banderas, here playing Antipater's father, Herod the Great. And Banderas is definitely the highest profile secular actor in this, and I feel like he does some pretty decent scene chewing as this increasingly degenerating villain, but quite frankly, I feel like Banderas and especially Smallbone's characters come the closest, despite being supporting villains, to having some kind of identifiable arc, but even there, I just don't think it's fleshed out enough. And that's definitely the main drawback to Journey to Bethlehem from a strictly narrative perspective. Musicals are a really tricky needle to thread because while the musical numbers themselves are essential mechanics for conveying narrative, you have to be careful to not rely on them too much to simply explain emotional arcs and motivations. Otherwise, it ends up feeling like you're kind of cheating your way around really finding a way to get us invested in and caring about characters when they're not singing and dancing. And with Journey to Bethlehem, I understand that the means were fairly limited, but I just can't help but feel Anders and Barsaccini come up really short in terms of making it feel like there's this fluidity between more conventional dramatic narrative and musical numbers. And especially where it seems like they go for musical numbers too soon, musical numbers like Good to Be a King that feel like they're kind of just begging for some kind of reprise, if only for dramatic punctuation later in the film. They just don't get them. And overall, there really doesn't seem to be a very elegant use of musical motif to be able to help us follow the story emotionally and to more do so in an understated way that I feel like Anders was trying to go for somewhat in certain respects, especially when it comes to the central narrative of Mary, played by Fiona Palomo, and Joseph, their first forced into this arranged marriage and then further thrown into this situation where they have to rely on faith and trust in one another to get themselves out of danger. Obviously, they do the thing where they try to portray Mary as a more complicated, more contemporary feeling teenage girl who from the beginning has to be married out of tradition and obligation, but doesn't necessarily want to be with this stranger and doesn't necessarily have faith that this arranged marriage can work. But really all it adds up to is that this is primarily resolved through Joseph proving himself as being faithful and committed to Mary. And don't get me wrong, I think Anders and Barsaccini do an okay job of crafting a version of the Blessed Virgin who's a little more spry and active in the story, but at the end of the day, the filmmakers try to go for this more, it could be argued, woke interpretation of this Christian biblical character, and I just kind of makes me wish that they didn't bother at all. Because I feel like in the case of the Virgin Mary, this character actually becomes less relatable because in metaphorical terms, you're literally juxtaposing first her lack of agency in her life, these cultural traditions that demand she submit to her father and have her marriage arranged. You're literally juxtaposing that with her being also arranged by God to be the mother of the Messiah. And while I understand in principle why those things are thematically connected, connected. I think what Anders and Barsaccini do here is attempt to kind of infer that it's only the latter that redeems the former, that they're approaching the narrative ironically in a way. They're trying to contrast the dehumanizing laws and traditions of man, the one where Mary can either marry a pure as white virgin or be stoned to death, with the redeeming power of God, that God is the one who actually ordains love, that his law is not necessarily the same as man's law. But I just don't feel like the relationship between Mary and Joseph is fleshed out well enough, and in particular, I don't think Mary does enough of substance in the story in terms of actually making demands of Joseph after he's already initially dismissed her as basically a whore and made her a pariah from the community because, he didn't believe women. I don't think the filmmakers really do enough to actually get the most out of this kind of woke version of Mary by not just making her a vessel of God, but by basically making her an agent of God's will, the one who has to be to Joseph and say, look, this is how it's going to be. This is what you need to do. I also don't think Joseph's own doubts are interpreted in a very compelling way in the story. Inevitably, if you're a secular spectator like myself, you just sort of come to that really uncomfortable conclusion that Journey to Bethlehem is trying to be woke by Christian conservative standards, but just ends up proving what a dead end it is, because the vehicle for delivering this interpretation is already necessarily so sanitized and family friendly and squeaky clean. It can't really do anything but conflate the will of God with the will of a patriarchal hierarchy and the subjugation of women to men as mothers in a household, with Mary as a kind of partially divine model of orderly, perfect femininity. So to a certain extent, it makes you just wish they maybe didn't bother at all, because then I start wondering if an interpretation of Mary and Joseph who are accepting of tradition, who are already tolerant of their lot in life because it's all anybody really knows, who recognize that marriage is a contract between families that isn't really about the kind of modern sensation of love as we understand it. I start wondering if that isn't actually a more interesting and compelling idea, because ironically, by taking the pretense and conception of marrying for love out of the equation completely, you start out the characters in this much more harrowing position where the light of God and the might of this prophecy descends upon both of them, and they just have to figure it out and maybe get into some screwball comedy because they were already willing to take the plunge into marriage and just do what they're supposed to do, but now they actually have to figure out how to live apart from those traditions as their own people, because Mary has to make a sacrifice by claiming she's the mother of this immaculate child. Joseph has to make a sacrifice by sticking by her. I feel like you make a more compelling and interesting story where you take love out of the equation for both characters, and they find love ironically by having to be forced in a situation where they really do divert completely from what the traditions are, where the traditions are that they are supposed to be marrying not for love, but for the obligation itself. Because honestly, that would be a more interesting way to take the story, because how would that even work? How are you going to be able to fight for this woman? How are you going to be able to stick by this man? How are you going to be able to protect the Messiah if you guys don't love each other? Are you really going to accept this burden from God just because of some obligation? No, because it's not the same as being married by your parents because of its convenient social and interpersonal significance. It's a completely different kind of covenant with a higher power where you need to be inspired to something that earthly laws do not mandate. But I'm already doing the thing I keep doing that I should not do, which is spitballing improvements to a movie. Just because I think Journey to Bethlehem is underdeveloped doesn't mean the hypothetical movie I'm seeing in my head would be any better, especially if Anders is still handling it, because at the end of the day, a musical lives and dies on its music, and the songs that have been written here by Anders and his wife, Nikki Anders, are already mediocre from a compositional standpoint, but the lyrics in particular tend to be just awful. The opening original number, Mary's Getting Married, is particularly terrible. I mean, this is just the chorus to that song. Mary, Mary, married is something you do. Like, it would be an awful line anyway, but that could so easily be Mary getting married is something you do. You guys just got greedy for no reason by putting Mary in there twice and trying to spin on it with the third version being married. Mary, Mary, married is something good you do. That's very, 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 very good for you. It's like a kid cheating on a school book report word count limit.
And they were very, 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 very happy to be home.
Mary, Mary, married makes two hearts into one happy life. Engagement, then the invitations, ceremony, celebration, dreams are coming true. Mary, 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 married is good for you. Awful. Just awful stuff. So from the jump, we're off to a bad start, and while I will say that none of the other musical numbers have lyrics quite as terrible as that, not a single one necessarily has good lyrics either. But even before that, we've got to hear this awful arena-scaled, almost Imagine Dragons-esque rendition of O Come Emmanuel, which is, of course, the only song that gets a reprise in this movie, and I'm sorry, that song sucks. I get this is a story about the first Christmas, but did we really need actual Christmas carols padding out the runtime here? I'm sorry, I have to believe even among conservative Christians, everyone's gonna get more than their fill of that song and Silent Night, which, yes, also gets a rendition here. Everyone's gonna get their fill of that some other way this month. I would say it's shocking how forced it ends up coming across in the film, but then again, why wouldn't it be forced? It's not like Anders is Stephen Schwartz working on The Prince of Egypt and he's culling excerpts from the Song of the Sea and putting it into When You Believe. He's just taking the most obvious, hackiest compositions of the Western European Christian canon and shoehorning them into the most obvious sections of a story that are taking place literally hundreds of years before the Christian church has even formed. Look, Anders, my man, they're already plucking you out of the ranks of gay, liberal, satanic Hollywood to make their nativity story. Do you think you could have maybe taken along some nice Jewish songwriters with you to give these Jewish characters maybe some cultural texture, give these musical numbers some of that old vaudeville pizzazz? That's sort of the thing, isn't it? Christian musicals tend to be so self-serious because you can do all this superficial stuff about how, hey, let's interpret the Virgin Mary as a slightly less passive role to minimize the inherent sexism of the story, but you can't actually make fun of the myth itself or imply that there's an inherent absurdity to it. With Christian musicals, you're not allowed to take pot shots at God, whereas I feel like there's a much longer tradition of Jewish humor, specifically getting to the point of the absurdity of what God often demands of his chosen people. And Journey to Bethlehem certainly continues that trend of disparity between faiths and its relationship to popular art, because Anders really does seem to want to inject more elements of secular farce into this, but his hands are tied not so much by the demands to make something family-friendly, but simply because even if he thinks God must have some type of a sense of humor, he's literally not allowed to actually push the envelope in terms of offering a dramatic interpretation of scripture that has to necessarily challenge a more conventional, anodyne interpretation that doesn't allow for the idea that there are inherently absurd things about the nativity story and about what these two teenage characters would have had to go through. I also wanted to make a minor note of how at the end of the movie, Anders and his wife literally appeared on camera during the closing credits, and basically they're doing a thing where they're asking audience members to scan a barcode so that they can donate tickets to other people, which I don't know if anyone remembers. It's something that Sound of Freedom and Golda also campaigned with this year, and it's honestly such a clearly cynical way to basically invite upper middle class and wealthy Christians to artificially artificially inflate the box office success of a film. And that barcode stayed up during the whole closing credits. But on top of everything else, if we have no other reason to be ambivalent about the expansion of conservative Christian film in the ecosystem of commercial cinema, the fact that they're inviting audiences to take out their phones in the theater should be enough for us to treat the artistic integrity of these folks with extreme suspicion. Like, the film literally ends by begging you for money in the form of purchasing tickets to showtimes that nobody's going to attend. They're trying to pass around the collection plate so that they can make lots of money, but people don't even have to see the movie to know if it's any good or not. It's really shady stuff to me, and it should be a reminder that for as much as the production value of your average faith-based film improves, at heart, these individuals come from an orientation where the actual value of art is secondary or wholly irrelevant. They see no contradiction in their values by asking conservative Christian audiences to basically help them lie about how well their film is doing and how many people it actually resonates with. These are people whose cultural products we need to view through a lens of oppositional critical fascination, but it's important to not get too wrapped up in this idea that any future redemption of low to mid-budget diversity in the movie marketplace rests with them. It's a very, very, very cynical niche of the market. While this is certainly part of a trend of Christian films being better produced technically overall, it's also just a very flat and often grating, forced production that just isn't very exciting in the one place where a musical needs to be exciting. I'm giving Journey to Bethlehem a 2 out of 5. And honestly, technically well-produced but decidedly lackluster also happens to be the story of the second half of our Too Early for Christmas double feature. Up next, we've got It's a Wonderful Knife, a new novelty slasher from the studio Divide Conquer, written by Michael Kennedy and directed by Tyler McIntyre. The concept of a novelty slasher is nothing new, especially when it comes to holiday-themed horror movies. In fact, going back to the original Black Christmas and Halloween, you could make an argument that as a coherent genre, the origins of slashers has always been tied into dark twists on American holidays as a high concept premise. Whether we're talking about Friday the 13th or New Year's Evil or My Bloody Valentine or April Fool's Day, or just the entire canon of Christmas-themed slashers preceding It's a Wonderful Knife. But I identify It's a Wonderful Knife as being part of a far more recent trend in novelty slashers going back to at least Happy Death Day from 2017, which took the general concept of a non-horror film, in that case Groundhog Day, and reformatted it into a slasher film. And the success of that film for producers Blumhouse Productions has clearly inspired a small mini trend of similar cash grab horror film reworkings of older films, with Happy Death Day being followed by Freaky from 2020, which basically did a slasher movie version of Freaky Friday, that one being co-produced by Blumhouse and Divide Conquer, and also being written by Michael Kennedy, the writer of It's a Wonderful Knife. And from earlier this October, Blumhouse and Divide Conquer released another novelty slasher, Totally Killer, which is something of a slasher twist on Back to the Future. In this case, It's a Wonderful Knife is obviously a variation on Frank Capra's classic It's a Wonderful Life. The basic premise is that a high school senior named Winnie, played by Jane Widdop, on Christmas Eve, she and her friends are the target of a white-clad, knife-wielding maniac who turns out to be a psychopathic real estate tycoon, Henry Waters. He's played by Justin Long, obviously a thematic stand-in for Mr. Potter in the original film. Waters kills several of Winnie's friends before she's able to kill him. A year passes and Winnie is still deeply traumatized by those events and is bitterly resentful because her family seems to have entirely moved on from them, and so she ends up on the pier on the outskirts of town on Christmas Eve under the Aurora Borealis in this part of the country, located entirely over this one small town, and wishes that she was never born, which then transports her to an alternate present in which she wasn't there to stop Henry Waters, and he now controls the town, and the killer alter ego continues to run amok all year long. And I started to realize that we were already off to a bad start because even so far as how inherently silly a slasher film reworking of It's a Wonderful Life is, to say that the movie is tongue-in-cheek is a severe understatement and also too charitable to the kind of pervasive overtone of nothing about the premise being taken very seriously for even 1 second, even if it would be just convenient from a storytelling perspective. Even in that context, the fact is that Kennedy and McIntyre fumbled the bag right out of the gate because either they don't realize or they simply don't care that Winnie's motivations in this story for wishing she was never born just don't make any sense. Because George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life is not a guy whose motivations for wishing he was never born comes about because of some violent trauma. He's just a guy who's had all of his dreams and ambitions in life constantly deferred by a sense of his obligations to others. He basically just has a nervous breakdown, and in the context of It's a Wonderful Life, you could even argue that the entire coda in which he sees the world had he never existed is something of an absurd and extreme non sequitur in which this guy who has already given so much for others is just aggressively browbeaten for, like, despite never having once thought only about himself, still having the temerity to have some resentment over his lot in life. And this is coming from someone who really loves It's a Wonderful Life. I think there's a extent to which even the original film, that ending doesn't really make a lot of sense. In the case of It's a Wonderful Knife, though, we have this sort of descending order of these sense of the moral of the movie and the motivations of the characters and really the point of the story becoming increasingly disentangled from a real coherent sense of how all of these individual scenes and events are supposed to be tied together into something coherent enough that you can get invested in it, even as a kind of high concept, absurd black comedy. Because Winnie would obviously not make the same wish that George Bailey does, because we're given no indication in the story that her experiences are even remotely comparable to that kind of situation. She's just a regular teenager who goes through this extraordinarily violent scenario where her closest friend dies horribly, but she survives. So it seems rather obvious to me that what should be informing her trauma is a sense of survival's guilt, that she wouldn't wish that she was never born so much as she would wish that she had died instead, that she had made a sacrifice so that her friend could live. And so just from the jump, It's a Wonderful Knife, even by its own high concept, not terribly serious standards, just at the basic level of how you actually do a slasher twist on It's a Wonderful Life, it totally fumbles the ball and is not very imaginative at all, because it just feels like the minds behind the film are overly satisfied just by what, as the film goes on and on and on, just turns out to be not a terribly interesting twist on a slasher film anyway. It's very hard to get into the movie because from the very beginning, it's not so much that the filmmakers aren't taking themselves too seriously. You just get this very overt sense that they didn't take anything seriously about their job as storytellers, that even a minimal level of thought was not put into this. Which proves increasingly unfortunate because as a production, It's a Wonderful Knife is actually really impressive. The design is great. I love the design for the White Angel slasher villain. It has a great look overall. Cinematographer Nicholas Piatnik's work here is especially impressive. And when it comes to the slashing scenes themselves, there are some really ingenious original set pieces here with generally really well choreographed slayings. But the feeling behind it is completely hollow, and you get the sense of It's a Wonderful Knife being a movie that everybody involved had a lot of fun making, but where the film itself is just an incredible chore as a comedy slasher. It's also just not funny. Again, you get the feeling that Kennedy and McIntyre got a little too comfortable just resting upon the supposedly inherent absurdity of It's a Wonderful Life reimagined as a slasher movie, but there's virtually nothing done to develop a comedic sensibility on its own, to be a funny movie that works on its own terms and not just by taking it for granted that we as an audience will find this idea as inherently amusing as the filmmakers do. Because at the end of the day, we've seen black comedy slashers before. What we haven't seen is really well done black comedy slashers inspired by classics of the American film canon. And on that front, in spite of how good this movie looks, the only word I can really use to describe the feeling of watching it is just lazy. A new holiday horror classic. This is not. I'm giving It's a Wonderful Knife a 1.5 out of 5. Yeah, not a great double feature this week. I really ought to have seen The Holdovers, but you win some and you lose some. I know not everyone has the same morbid fascination with Christian and faith-based movies as I do, but hopefully I've spared some of you out there the ordeal of It's a Wonderful Knife. With that, I'm going to wrap things up. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.